You get to the Hi everyone, thank you for coming, for joining us online and in person. My name is Claudia, I'm researcher at OPHI, I'm organizing the seminars. Today the seminars will be moderated by my colleague Ricardo Nogales. Ricardo is our research associate at OPHI. Mysterious white. He will be introducing the speakers of the seminar and he will be moderating the Q&A at the end. So in case you have any question, there will be some time at the end to ask and to engage with the speakers. So Ricardo, I will just hand it over.
Thank you very much, Claudia. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear me well. So it is an honor for me to be your host for this seminar and to start this series. It's a real pleasure to see a lot of you online and a lot of you in person in Oxford, colleagues, students, researchers, and friends who share the curiosity and the interest in advancing the study and practice of multidimensional poverty. So let me just start by saying that this seminar series that we host at OPHI is very special for us because it's not only a set of presentations, but it's a space of discussion and an interchange session where we want to have intellectual exchange in terms of bringing together scholars, practitioners who are working on poverty measurements, policy design, human development in general, to present not only new research, but also very crucially to explore how we put that research to use and inform real-world action. So throughout the series, starting today, you will be hearing from leading voices in the field, and you will see emerging researchers who are pushing boundaries of how we think about deprivation, poverty, inequality. And I very much encourage you to take an active role in the series starting today. So again, we see this series as not only a set of presentations, but a conversation that we need to have. So please ask questions, please offer comments, please connect with each other, first of all, and also with the speakers, either in person or online, to enrich in the discussions that we have. So without further ado, as Claudia said, we will have two presenters starting today's seminar, who are going to take up the mic and the screen for about 40-45 minutes, and then leading up to a Q&A session where I invite all of you to take place. So the theme of today's presentation will be the 2025 Global Multidimensional Poverty Index with a focus on overlapping hardships, poverty, and climate hazards. So our presenters are going to be the two of the authors of this report. So first and foremost, Professor Sabina Alkire, who is the director of the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative at the University of Oxford, who together with Professor James Foster developed what we know by now as the Alkire and Foster method for measuring multidimensional poverty. This method is a very flexible technique that can incorporate different dimensions and aspects of poverty to create measures that are tailored and useful for different contexts. Together with Sabina, we will also hear in the room in Oxford from Lhachi Selden, who is a research and policy officer at OPHI, where she provides expert support on the development of the Global Multidimensional Poverty Index, but she also works very closely with OPHI's outreach team to assist countries and international partners in designing and computing national, regional, and linked multidimensional poverty indices. Without further ado, then, Sabina and Lhachi, the mic and the screen are all yours.
Thank you so much, Ricardo. With grim timing, one of the most powerful Atlantic hurricanes ever recorded swept through the Caribbean. And just as the international community prepares for the next stage of deliberations over climate action at the COP30 Climate Summit, and the scale of its devastation, like that of so many others, forced tens of thousands of people to take shelter. And it demonstrates why research on climate and poverty is really needed to inform effective responses. And so as families in shelters figure out how they can return to their homes across the Caribbean, speaking up for poor people in the face of climate crises is vital. And this year, we, together with the UNDP, had the privilege to do a report entitled Overlapping Hardships, Poverty and Climate Hazards. And that tries to recognize that climate shocks are growing in frequency and intensity, and that they have human impacts of suffering and deprivation, but that these do not occur in isolation, but they occur over and alongside other types of deprivation that are related to poverty. And we wanted to create a way of looking at both of these together. And to do so, we use the global MPI, which itself, as a standalone measure, already looks at a global view of poverty that Lhachi will present. And then as the theme this year, we compounded that with the overlapping climate hardships people are experiencing or exposed to based on the location in which they live. So Lhachi will present what the global MPI is, how it's updated, and the key findings. And then I'll go into some of the climate results that were the work of many people, including Ricardo Nogales, Bea Jambrina, Niall Maher, and Nabalika Dehingia, who are co-authors of the working paper, the research in progress paper. So I'll hand it over to Lhachi as I share my screen.
Good afternoon to everyone in the room and those online. So in this first section, I will be giving you an overview of what the global MPI is, and some key findings from this year's report update, as well as some of the findings that we explored with the update estimate. So for those who are not familiar with the global MPI, I'm just going to give a brief overview on how we calculate poverty for each individual that we do in the MPI. So the global MPI looks at multidimensional deprivation across three major dimensions, namely health, education, and living standards, as well as 10 indicators within three dimensions. And to calculate poverty for each individual in the global MPI, we calculate a deprivation score for each individual. The three dimensions are weighted equally. They receive a weight with a third each, and each indicator within each dimension receives an equal weight. The two health indicators and the two education indicators receive a weight of 6 each, and the 6 living standards indicator receive a weight of 18 each. Now, to explain this, we'll be using an example from Ricardo and Susanna's family, which they belong to an indigenous community in Bolivia. No children in the household attend school. No one has completed 6 years of schooling among Ricardo's siblings and the parents. And they use solid foods for cooking, such as wood and charcoal. So by the global MPI, they are deprived in both the indicators in the educational dimension, as well as one indicator from the living standard dimension. So if you add up the weights of those deprivations, so 6 plus 6 plus 19 is 38.9%, right? And now, according to the global MPI, in order to be considered multidimensionally deprived, you have to have a deprivation score of 33.3% or above. So by the global MPI, Ricardo and Susanna's family is multidimensionally poor. So we do this, we calculate each person's deprivation score, classify them as poor or non-poor for 109 developing countries across the world. The data from these countries come from multiple sources. So for 51 countries, we use the multiple educator classes surveys, and 44 countries we use demographic and health surveys, and national surveys are used for 14 countries. This year's global MPI, we present updated estimates for 13 countries, that are listed on the right-hand side of the slide. And for 88 countries, we have data for more than one point in time. And so we have trends analysis for 88 countries. And throughout these estimates, we provide disaggregation as well across subnational regions, by age groups, rural and urban areas, and dyslexic household types. So across these 109 countries, we find 6.3 billion. And of these 6.3 billion people, 18.3% or 1.1 billion live in acute multidimensional poverty.
Now, of these 1.1 billion people, 586 million are children. 27.8% of all children live in acute multidimensional poverty, which is more than double the rate among adults. This means that these 586 million children are deprived in the most basic standards of health, education, and living standards. And we report these numbers every year. They don't change a lot, but it's important because these numbers represent individuals, they represent human lives, right? And so to address poverty, we must focus on alleviating deprivations among our youngest populations. In this slide, in the diagram, you can see the deprivation among poor people across the 10 indicators of the global MPI. You can see that most multidimensionally poor people lack clean cooking fuel, adequate housing, and adequate sanitation. And we also find high numbers in indicators of nutrition. And we see that over half all poor people lack access to electricity or live in households where no one is 6 years of schooling, and nearly half live in households that don't have access to any good source of drinking water, or the sources are not located within a 30-minute round trip time for collection. So here we're looking at the distribution of poor people across world regions and income categories. The green bars represent middle-income countries, and the orange bars represent low-income countries. And of course, poverty is still very prevalent in low-income countries. We find that 408 million, or 62.5% of the population living in low-income countries, are multidimensionally poor. But if you look at middle-income countries, although only 25% of the middle-income country population are multidimensionally poor, they form nearly 2/3 of all poor people globally. And so we see that middle-income countries are a hidden center of acute multidimensional poverty, which is not something you'd expect, right? You think that if a country were in a high-income classification, they would represent better standards of living. But we see that this is not the case. And so this area needs to be addressed. Every poor person in the regions of East Asia and the Pacific, Europe and Central Asia, Latin America and the Caribbean, and every poor person in South Asia, except those living in Afghanistan, live in middle-income countries. As 40% of the poor people living in Sub-Saharan Africa that are poor. And here we see the number of people who are multidimensionally poor and deprived across the indicators according to where they live by income category. And across the board, we can see that a large proportion of deprivations in every indicator are formed by those people living in middle-income countries. Nearly a third of poor people who cook with solid fuels that endanger health and the environment live in middle-income countries. 57.7% of poor people who lack good sanitation facilities or share them with other households live in middle-income countries. Only in the indicators of drinking water and electricity are deprivations higher in terms of number of poor people in low-income countries. For MPI data that we update every year, we're able to see how poverty changes across world regions, across countries, and across subnational regions within countries. So on the left-hand side most figure of the world region, we see that the highest deprivations are in Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, which forms over 82% of poor people worldwide. This is followed by the Arab states. And then in the middle chart, if you zoom into the countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, you can also see how poverty varies within the regions. So in Sub-Saharan Africa, the country with the lowest headcount ratio is Senegal, with a headcount ratio of only 1%, whereas in Chad, over 84% of the population live in multidimensional poverty. Then further, if you zoom into the subnational regions of Senegal, you can see that the incidence of poverty also varies quite a bit. The national headcount ratio in Senegal is 45.1%, but its least poor region, the capital city of Dakar, the headcount ratio is only 12.9%, whereas its poorest region, Kaffrine, experiences a headcount ratio of 85.8%. This this, sorry, Sabina. Yeah, and this disaggregation is available not just for subnational regions that we've seen here. We do this for rural and urban areas by age cohort and by the gender of the household head. And so for each of these groups, you're able to see the composition of poverty in the tables that we publish every year. And you can see how and what deprivations we use in order to address the needs of the poorest. Here in this figure, we compare the incidence of multidimensional poverty with the incidence of monetary poverty, as both measures are needed to provide a complete picture of poverty, right? So the orange and yellow bars here represent the incidence of multidimensional poverty, and the black dots represent the incidence of monetary poverty, calculated using the World Bank $3 a day measure. And to the countries on the right-hand side of the figure, indicated by the blue arrows, you can see that the incidence of MPI in Chad, Guinea, Mauritania, and Sudan is higher than monetary poverty estimates by over 40 percentage points. And conversely, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Kenya, Malawi, and other countries, the headcount ratio of multidimensional poverty is lower by more than 20 percentage points. And so you can see that the same group of people are not accurately captured if you use one measure or the other, and that both are needed to provide a comprehensive picture of poverty in order to combat it consequently. We also have analysis for 88 countries that have data for more than one result in time to look at the trends in the change of poverty. And 76 of the 88 countries that we studied, this covers over 5.6 billion people, have reduced MPI values in at least one period. And of the 25 countries to reduce the MPI, 8 are low-income countries and 12 are middle-income countries. Now, for these 88 countries, we're able to disaggregate results across 882 subnational regions, and we find that 15 countries reduced MPI in every subnational region, and 11 countries have reduced deprivations across every indicator in their MPI. We also did a short analysis of countries that have trend data that's spanning between or after, starting in 2018 or later and ending in 2021, 2022 or later, which we would assume is post-pandemic period, right? This is the pandemic period. And we find that only in 6 of these 91 subnational regions have seen a statistically significant reduction in poverty, which could suggest stagnation that the pandemic caused in reduction in poverty. In this year's Global MPI report, we also looked at a small snapshot of the Small Island Developing States, or the SIDS. So the Global MPI covers 22 SIDS, which represents around 57.6 million people. And we find that in the SIDS, 23.5% are multidimensionally poor. And this average is higher than the global average, which says that 18.3% of the whole population covered by the Global MPI experience acute multidimensional poverty. The poverty rates within the states also vary quite a lot. They vary from less than 1% in Cuba, Maldives, Seychelles, and Tonga, Trinidad and Tobago, over 40% in some countries like Guinea-Bissau, Haiti, Papua New Guinea, and Timor-Leste. The Small Island Developing States also see a significant subnational disparity within their subnational regions. In Guyana, for example, the national headcount ratio is 1.8%, but the subnational regions see a variation in headcount ratio from 0.1% to 23%. And in all SIDS except Cuba and the Seychelles, children are poorer than adults. This is particularly important for this year's results and this year's thematic report, because SIDS are acutely susceptible to a lot of climate hazards, due to rising sea levels and storms and flooding. And this provides a perfect leeway into the next section of the presentation, where Sabina will talk a little bit about the findings from the thematic side of the report.
Thank you so much, Lhachi. That's very clear and very helpful. We turn now to look at how this situation that Lhachi has described of people whose lives are being battered and diminished, as Amartya would say, in many various ways by the deprivations of poverty, are being struck in the same time period by different climate hazards. And we know that these climate hazards are various. They vary by region of the country and across countries. And we were not able, of course, to capture all of them. But this year, we wanted to at least start to link poverty with these planetary pressures and instability. And so we did so by measuring the people who, in the same year in which they were poor, were exposed to one of 4 climate hazards: high heat, drought, flood, or air pollution. And we, in particular, we went down to use the subnational data of the MPI where possible, and we overlaid that with these 4 climate hazards. And in particular, a person was exposed to heat if the region in which they lived had 30 days or more with a maximum temperature of 35 degrees Celsius or higher. If they were exposed to drought if they had a relatively dry year that year, flooding if there were 10 deaths or 100 or more people affected, if a state of emergency was declared or international assistance was required in the area in which they lived. And air pollution if basically it was a polluted region according to the WHO target of having less than 35 micrograms per cubic meter of particulate matter that was 2.5 millimeters. And the data sets are on the right. Overall, of the 1.1 billion people that Lhachi identified as being multidimensionally poor, 78.8%, nearly 80% of poor people, were exposed to at least one climate hazard. And that added up to 887 million people who were poor and exposed to one or more climate hazards. The most prevalent hazard was high heat that affected 608 million people, followed by air pollution that covered regions that were home to 577 million poor people, floods 465 million, and drought 270 million poor people. So that was our question. Now, where do these poor people live? In all 4 of these maps, the poverty is on the bottom and it is blue in cover, and the darker blue shows the higher number of poor people. This is not incidence, this is number. We could also do this map for the incidence, but taking human rights or each person matters, this map is in the number. And the red is people who are exposed to high heat and in that subnational region. And the darker red is the more intense poverty. So the dark red is both high poverty in terms of number of poor and exposure to the different threats. So if we just zoom in a little bit, if you look at high heat, for example, and look at West Africa, that's very affected by high heat. And if you look at air pollution, West Africa is also quite affected. If you go back to the top and you look at high heat for South Asia, that's nearly universal. And if you go down to flood for South Asia, that's quite extensive. And if you go over to air pollution for South Asia, that's also extensive. But if you look at Northeast Brazil, you can see that flood, drought, high heat are all affecting Northeast Brazil, particularly flood and drought. And if you look, for example, at China, then flood and air pollution are affecting it greatly. So the different world regions have different mixes of deprivations that are more prevalent. But we tried with some subnational precision to map where those were. So let's collect this by world region. If we look across all of the regions, as I said, 887 million people live in regions affected to one or more climate hazards. 650 million people are affected by 2 or more at the same time, and 309 million by 3 or more. And you look in this diagram at the number of poor people who are simultaneously exposed to a climate hazard. So in South Asia, it's 380 million people, and in sub-Saharan Africa, it's 344 million people. So those regions are clearly the largest numbers of people that are simultaneously affected by poverty and climate hazards. If you look at South Asia, the yellow at the bottom are people affected by one hazard only. And the next group are affected by 2 hazards. But you see that most poor people in South Asia are affected by 3 hazards, very few by 4, 11 million at a global level. Moving over to sub-Saharan Africa, happily, a greater number are affected by only 1 hazard, but 2 or 3 are also significant. But you can see in East Asia and the Pacific, it's the next most prevalent region in terms of poverty and climate hazards. If we then return to the categories that Lhachi stressed of low, middle, and upper middle income countries, we actually also have a surprise. So of the 887 million people who are poor and climate affected, 548 million of them live in lower middle income countries, by far the highest, followed by low income countries that are home to 246 million of them. But you also see that in the lower middle income countries, the orange bars, rather than the yellow bar, are larger. And so again, we're seeing in lower middle income countries, 470 million poor people are exposed to 2 or more hazards. And so 88% of all poor people in lower middle income countries are affected by 1 or more climate hazards. In upper middle income countries, you can see that not as many people are affected, 93 million people, but that's 91% of all poor people in middle income countries. And so it is the poor in the upper middle income countries who are buffeted at the same time by the climate crises. In the lower middle income countries, poverty is much higher. So 61% of poor people are also affected by climate hazards. But poverty is really the pressing problem and overwhelming problem in those countries, as Lhachi pointed out, the headcount ratio being over 60%. So how are these 3 countries affected by the climate hazards? At the bottom are the low-income countries, and the blue are air pollution, the green are floods, the orange is drought, and the red is heat. So heat is the highest in the low-income countries, and over 1/3 of poor people are affected also by high heat. But if you move up to the lower middle income countries, 71.7% of poor people are affected by high heat, and 71% are affected by air pollution. And also in the upper middle income countries, air pollution affects 63% of the poor. So what you're seeing is that in the middle income countries, air pollution is much higher, but so are floods. And at least in lower middle income countries, so is high heat. So there are different configurations. As I'll say at the end, these are not the only deprivations that are of interest. And we would want to look at others, but of these 4, this is the pattern across these countries. We also looked ahead, and in particular, we looked at heat. I remember that to be exposed to heat, you experience 30 or more days where the temperature maximum of the day is 35 degrees or higher centigrade. And looking at the emissions scenarios, we divided the countries into 4 quartiles according to their levels of MPI. So the poorest countries are on the right-hand side, and the least poor are on the left-hand side. And we did 2 scenarios, one through 2059 and one through 2099. And in 2040 to 2059, we find that in the least poor places, they will experience 24 additional days of 35 degree or more heat, and the poorest places will experience 37 or more. But by 2080 to 2099, the least poor places will have 2 additional months of high heat, 62 days. And the poorest MPI countries will have 3 additional months, 92 high heat days. So this is indeed very worrying, but it also shows that the poorest places are poised to have the highest rise in these kind of climate hazards, which does mean that focusing on these now, measuring them, addressing them, looking at adaptation is crucially important. So this slide has all of what I've showed you for the regions of the world in the low and the middle income countries. And what I just wanted to point out is that there are hotspots. For example, across South Asia, 99.1% of poor people are experiencing one or more hazard. And in the Arab states, it's even higher, 97.6%. But even in Latin America and East Asia, it's over 84% of poor people experience one or more climate hazards. These are troubling. They are also consonant with the safe and just Earth system boundaries literature that finds South Asia and Southeast Asia particularly to be hotspots where the Earth is transgressing safe and just boundaries. But they are also, in a sense, an investment in hope. As we know from the global MPI, South Asia has had very strong reduction in poverty, be it in India, where nearly 415 million people came out of poverty in 15 years, in Bangladesh, in Nepal. We've had very strong reduction of multidimensional poverty. And so our hope is that going forward with this information on simultaneous climate hazards, South Asia will also chart a way going forward to address both together effectively and quickly, as it has shown the way in terms of multidimensional poverty. But also over 30 countries have cut their multidimensional poverty index value by 1/2. And we hope that those countries will simultaneously take into account their climate hazards and have joined up responses. So coming towards a conclusion, this double burden of poverty and of climate hazards cannot be ignored. We have focused on 4 climate hazards, but there are others we should have focused on. We might want to include fire which devastates poor people in so many countries. We might want to consider forest loss, or salination, or desertification, or cyclones, as we have just tragically witnessed with Hurricane Melissa. So there are other kinds of hazards that this kind of measured simultaneous analysis could and should cover. But even with these 4, we are showing a strong overlap between the situation of poverty and of climate hazards. In a time when we are also observing contractions of development assistance and a remaking of that, we recognize that we need desperately to support the low-income countries, where poverty is much higher and more intense. But we must also recognize that nearly 2/3 of poor people live in lower middle-income countries, and that 88% of those poor people in middle-income countries are affected by one or more climate hazards. And so they do bear the greatest burden of these overlaps, and so are a population of particular interest and cannot be just neatly graduated from our concern. And we only shared the forward-looking scenarios for heat, but there are, of course, forward-looking scenarios for all of the hazards that we covered. And it is important to look not only at how these will intensify, but taking a human perspective about how the higher intensities will be structured across different levels of poverty. I showed you at the national level, but we should also look at the subnational level, because often the poorest subnational regions, even in less poor countries, are those most affected. So this report is a first step. It is not a last step on these issues, but it is one that we hope speaks into the policy environment and will continue to speak into it. Many doing research want the research to have an impact so that it can help to shape policy, but where you're working on poverty, that impact and having it, trying to make that link easy is all the more important. As Sir Tony Atkinson taught us, saying that these metrics, when it comes to poverty, must be linked to action. And so we are very grateful that in the run-up or in the follow-up to the report, Juan Manuel Santos, the former president of Colombia, who gained a Nobel Peace Prize for bringing peace to Colombia, while he also reduced its multidimensional and monetary poverty by 1/3, who is now chair of the elders, cited this report in an op-ed. And he demanded attention and not fatalism to the overlap between climate and poverty. And the COP30 president also cited this in his recently published 8th letter on adaptation finance, saying that unprecedented data from the 2025 global MPI published by UNDP on the 17th of October shows that 1.1 billion of 6.3 billion people in 109 countries live in acute multidimensional poverty, that over half of them are children, and that of these, 887 live in regions already facing at least one major climate hazard. 309 face 3 or more simultaneously. And he wrote, empathy compels us to see the human faces behind these figures. Families displaced by floods, farmers watching fields wither, children walking miles for water, small and micro entrepreneurs losing their business and dreams. And it's that kind of intersection between numbers, empathy, and action that we are hoping this report will contribute to. In order to do that, and I wanted to say on the heading, you could be next. So we would welcome, we would request, we would celebrate if people on this call could also reach out, write out, and analyze these results for your own region and try to raise a call of action and see what is interesting for you in the work that you do, for which we are grateful. In closing, I'd like to recognize that the Global MPI report is always a great teamwork. And we are grateful to a large team for the results we shared. Rakesh Mishra, Lhachi Selden, Som Kumar Shetra, and Nikolai Supa led the computations this year. We miss and recognize the earlier presence of Usha Kanagaratnam on this team. The climate paper and research was done by Malika Dahingia, Beatriz Jambrina Conseco, Niall Maher, and Ricardo Nogales. Ricardo is only moderating the session, but it was a key researcher of all that I presented and will answer all of the hard questions. All of these people fact-checked, as did Fanny Koveshti. And there was a large comms design and production team. Maya Evans, Admir Yachic, Marit Cavillo, Minji Quag, Stanislav Saling, Mariam Sumro. And for the Bolivia story, we're grateful to Fernando Avermayo and Milenka Ocampo. And we were peer-reviewed by Radhika Khosla, Antonio Avila Uribe, and Lara Schwartz, and we're grateful to them. And Nicolas Debsky in HDRO helped us also with the climate data, and Gretchen Luchinger helped us be concise. So Pedro Consensao, Yanchun Zhang, and I had the privilege to support this research work in various ways, but we are full of gratitude for the team that really did this work. And we rely on you to help us improve the work, to criticize it, to take it further. And there's a research in progress paper 78A online if you are the type who likes the details. So I'd just like to say that all the numbers that we talked about or presented are online on OPHI's website, and the QR code is here. And the UNDP also have data at the national level and for countries available. We have country briefings, we have the StatAdo files online. There's an interactive data bank if you'd like to visualize these for your own PowerPoints or presentations. And of course, there's methodological notes. So if you want to know exactly the decisions taken for any data set, those are also online. So thank you so much for your part in this topic, for your interest and for your ongoing work. Back to you, Ricardo.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Sabina and Lhachi, for that excellent presentation. And I would just, before giving the mic to Claudia to collect some questions and comments in the room first, while I invite also people online to log in their questions, please, in the Q&A box, I would like to reiterate that this work is actually huge work on both fronts. So on the one hand, computing the MPI, updating the MPI with the microdata is always a very, very tricky work because of the amount of detail that it requires, but that was handled with the traditional precision that it does from the OPHI team on the computation side. But this year we wanted to go a little bit further and overlay that with another set of data that also was tricky to handle and that also was handled with a lot of care, which is the climate data that come from different sources. All with the purpose to actually have something that not only describes the patterns of poverty, which are interesting per se, but to see how poverty intersects with other elements that makes up people's lives. In this case, climate hazards. So thank you very much, Sabina and Lhachi. And then over first to Oxford and Claudia for some comments and questions from the room, please.
Thank you, Ricardo. Thank you, Sabina and Lhachi, for the presentation. Are there any questions in the room? I think not yet. So we're going to start with questions online.
We don't have questions online yet, but I do encourage people to start typing their questions in.
Sorry, I think there is one question here in the room.
Okay.
That first. Yes.
I was just wondering how the educational indicator was chosen to be 6 years as opposed to 5 or 7.
So I'll take this if Lhachi doesn't want to. So the original global MPI that was launched in 2010 had 5 years as the cutoff. But when we revised it in 2018, it was changed to 6 years because that is the average number of years of primary school across population-weighted countries that we work in. And so it was more coherent with the standards of primary schooling and with the basic number of years required for literacy. There is a paper with Usha Kanagaratnam published in the Oxford Journal of Development Studies and another with the director of the Human Development Report Office at that time that set out the justification for these standards of the revised global MPI. But I would recommend looking at the paper in Oxford Journal of Development Studies, our house journal, about those definitions. And we would be very interested in your assessments. There's no magic line or cutoff. Basic education could be 8 or 9 years. We are working on a moderate MPI that will basically make more ambitious the standards for each of the indicators, and that will have higher standards both for children school attendance and for the year of schooling variable, and it will also have gendered information for years of schooling. But the global MPI measures acute poverty, and so the equivalent of primary school or the number of years that usually equate with literacy, comfortable, confident literacy, was the standard chosen.
Thank you, Sabina. Do you have something more in the room, Claudia?
Yeah, there is another question in the room. Yes.
Yeah, another question for Sabina. I think she might have briefly mentioned it, but could she maybe clarify why she chose those specific 4 climate hazards and not like desertification, storms? I think she might have. Yeah.
I'll give the kindergarten answer and then Ricardo will give the real answer. It was very hard to decide. We looked at the number of people and the devastation by the indices, and that was one marker, was the number of people affected by different climate hazards across the world or across the regions that we were covering. And we wanted to look at those, and then we needed data that we could get at the subnational level. We couldn't get MDAT in the same way for some of the districts, but we were able to get subnational data for all of these 4 hazards relatively cleanly. But Ricardo, you will have a much better answer.
Yes, no, you actually said it very correctly, Sabina. So basically it was a compromise between data availability and also relevance. So at first we do have a set of indicators, climate indicators that we wanted theoretically actually to intersect with MPI. And of course, we had a bunch of indicators, but then when it comes to reality, we did want to have also subnational representativity of those climate hazards and also to be comparable across countries. That was also kind of a limiting factor. So we did have a lot of information, and I think it's a good thing that there's a growing number of data sets and databases on climate hazards. The tricky thing is that not all of them are globally comparable. So the ones that we were restricted to in the analysis were the ones that made sense from an MPI perspective, from a live perspective of people, but also that had internationally comparable thresholds, for example, to exactly pinpoint where you would have a flood or where you would have a drought. Now, when it comes to the certification, for example, drought more or less captures that because we measure that through a relatively evapotranspiration index, where you would kind of balance out the supply and demand of water, for example, to see whether or not, even though you did have rain, even though you did have some kind of supply of water, if you want, then combined with heat or combined with other conditions or use of water, demand of water, then you would have an insufficiency in that sense. So it's a balance, if you want, where the certification would actually have a lower supply of water, for example, while demand could be relatively stable. So that's taken into account indirectly, if you want, in the drought indicator. Going forward and tying into some questions that are upcoming now in the Q&A online, as Sabina said, I think this is the first step, not the last one for sure. So we do encourage actually people who are interested in going beyond this, not only from international organizations, but probably people who are doing their thesis on this, to maybe dig a little bit further into what happens with not only other climate hazards, but also in specific regions. Because there are some climate hazards that are, of course, affecting everyone globally, but there are some climate hazards that are perhaps more concentrated locally. So we need, and we call actually people to start thinking about this important issue with case studies, with more fine-tuned, for example, analysis, local analysis, where I think it's high time that we had this kind of conversation. I don't, Claudia, is it okay if we go probably to a couple of questions here online?
I think, yeah, we have a-
Yeah. So I don't know, Sabina, you can see all of them, but maybe one that I think it's important to clarify for everyone is the one posited by Sofath Fon, who says, who asks, how do we use subnational data to calculate the MPI? Because they see trouble in this exercise.
So thank you very much. We use, as Lhachi said, the demographic and health surveys and the multiple indicator cluster surveys. And we look at the disaggregation that they permit. So in Cambodia, for example, we use the 2022 demographic and health survey, and it permits disaggregation into subnational regions. It's representative by children and adults, different age cohorts. It's representative by rural and urban areas and by gender of the household head. If we are uncertain, we check with the survey providers and their sampling experts to make sure that the results are robust. And what you'll see is that OPHI publishes 3 methodological papers, and Rakesh Mishra and Lhachi Selden are the hard work behind those papers. And one of the 3 is just on the national results, but one of the 3 is on the disaggregated results. And in that paper, for each country that we update, we justify the disaggregation by the sample design. And the 3rd one is on changes over time and how we harmonized the indicators to be strictly comparable for looking at trends over time in a very coherent, consistent way for that country. So I'd recommend you look at the disaggregation paper if you'd like to have more information. We updated Cambodia, I believe, 2 years ago. And if you look at Table 8, you can have a hot link to that paragraph, and you'll see in Table 8 of the global MPI, we've recopied into the disaggregation, the justification for the disaggregation of Cambodia's districts. But for all of you, if you just want a quick fix, again, huge thanks to Rakesh and Lhachi, but Table 8 now includes the paragraph where we justify each of the decisions that we make with the data sets. So that if you disagree, you can criticize us. And if you're confused, you can see what we did. And it's maybe faster than checking the do file if you're just wanting a particular question about disaggregation answered.
Thank you very much, Sabina. And I do think that your answer actually responds also to Mohammed Rafiqul, who asked about how DHS can be used for the exercise of computing multidimensional poverty. And again, probably the best way, unless you want to say a couple of words, is to take a look at the technical notes and the methodological notes that we have, where we explain exactly how those data sets are used for computing when countries have them. Perhaps I don't know, Claudia, do you want to go back to the room? I have we have a bunch of questions here online.
Or there are like a couple of questions, I think, in the room. Yes.
Okay.
So I saw that the focus of the study was majorly on the global south, but we could say that there's a lot of impact in the upper middle income countries as well. So was that impact not noticed in the north? Is that why the global south is focused on, or was there any reason why this was done?
I'm pausing because Lhachi, if you want to answer any of these, please do jump up. Otherwise, I'll take this one, but Lhachi, feel free to go first. So in upper middle income countries, the data sets that we use cover 92% of the developing world. That is the low and middle income countries, 92% of the population in them. And we don't actually have data sets for many of the high income countries. We only include 3 high income countries in the global MPI. And so that's problems with having consistent and comparable data for high income countries. But we do cover a large population of the upper middle income countries in the global MPI.
Okay.
To add a little bit to what Sabina said, because the global MPI is just to clarify, just to add a little bit to what Sabina said, the global MPI is an acute measure of multidimensional poverty. So a lot of household surveys that we would require to do the computations don't include these because these are standards that high income countries have surpassed in a lot of ways. So it also
Ricardo, would you like to add something to that, or if not, I can check if there are any other.
Yeah, we do have questions. Sabina, do you want to pick one? I can suggest one, but I don't know if one catches your attention first.
And maybe I would answer one from Dilhani Dipawansa in Sri Lanka about how climate data is obtained, whether it's available at the household level or only for broader geographic areas, and would it be appropriate to integrate with household level data sets? So that's an important question. And as I mentioned, the team integrated using subnational regions in this case. And that is because, in a sense, we don't have the household level geolocation in all of the surveys of the DHS and mix. And further, where we do, there is some dislocation to provide anonymous data. And so some of the households are dislocated a certain number of kilometers to protect anonymity. However, where you do have the geolocation of the household or of the PSU, the primary sampling unit, then what you do is you take the satellite data that might be at the 50-meter level or the most unpixelated that you can, and you fix a polygon, often a radius, from the center of the household, and so you would say if the forest loss within 5 kilometers is this much, or you look at for cyclones, they have the radius of the cyclone, and you see if it overlapped with that location. So I think those are the ways in which, absolutely, if you have the geolocation of households, then you can go down to the household level, and then you just have to reshape the data into these many polygons, which is a little bit time intensive in Python, but it's possible to do. And we've done some exploratory work, which is still in process with Madagascar, that we've presented as work in progress, and it's nearly done. So then we'll be sharing that as well.
Yeah, thank you, Sabina. And thank you, Dilhani, for the question. And I would just add that actually, if you think about the connection between poverty and climate hazard, yes, the ideal would be to go as granular as possible. But here we were restricted to have a global analysis while having this in-country analysis that we wanted to know what happened within countries. That's the reason why we were restricted, because not all of the data sets were able to pinpoint exactly what happens at the household level. But in a more precise case study, if you want, Dilhani, we do think that actually the best practice would be to say what you're saying, to get a more granular way of understanding this. So if there is a way to know exactly the geolocation of the household data, and there is a way to create polygons that make sense, as Sabina was saying, then certainly we can have a much more nuanced and probably a much more precise notion of how climate hazard relates with poverty. Maybe we can go back to the room, Claudia, if you have any more insights.
Yeah.
You might not know the answer to this, but I was wondering if you've seen any different relative trends that have interested you. So say cases where climate risk has increased, but poverty has decreased, or vice versa. And if there's anything specific, certain policies that came in place that caught your attention. If that makes sense.
Hear that question?
Repeat it.
Yeah, maybe repeat it.
Yeah, basically, so we've seen there's this very strong correlation in general between poverty indices and climate risk, et cetera. And I was wondering whether you've seen any specific areas where there's diverging trends. So poverty is increasing, but climate risk is increasing, or vice versa, and whether there's any specific policies that have been put in place that could explain these.
So here I'm to blame. So the researchers very much wanted to look at trends and to do proper analyses of trends of poverty and trends of climate. And I said, I don't know that we can get that done in time. And so this report is limited to overlaps in one time period. It's important to look at trends. And I think that will be a next stage. It's also important to think about the data. And so let's go back to the household level, overlapping of data sets. But you could do that also for subnational, though it's probably less problematic with subnational if the data are available. The household level data are available and representative at the national level or at the subnational level. But if there's a microclimate where that household is in the midst, let's say, of a fire zone, and then in the next sample, they don't simply take any PSU, primary sampling unit, from that microclimate with lots of fires. It will look in your trends over time like fires went from high to zero. But actually, that's because you are assuming that the human sample represents the climactic zones and the hotspots of climate crises. So if you are doing trends over time, you have to be very careful to look at the human sample, to look at the climate sample, and to make sure that your conclusions based on the data are justified. And I mention this because with an increased ability to merge the climate and the satellite data and the household survey data, this has been done a lot, then there's a lot of carelessness in thinking about and interpreting the trends. And I'm quite worried about that. But if those sort of gory details of measurement are taken into account, I think the next phase of this work is to look over time, to look at associations, determinants, policies that worked, go much further into the dynamic analyses. But apologies, we kept it at one period because of me. So I just wanted something simple and clear.
Thank you very much, Sabina. And I do think that that's also caters to some of the questions that we had here about possible future research avenues in that respect. So certainly you've pinpointed one, and there are some others that we're actually thinking about. So I'm conscious about time, and I know that there are some questions that we have that we didn't have time to discuss, but I do encourage to reach out to the OPHI team. You have our emails, you have our institutional emails. So please do reach out, because again, this is a conversation that we want to get going. And I noticed that in the audience online, we do have Professor James Foster, who perhaps would like to give some final words to close the seminar. And before that, I would just like to thank all of you for joining, first of all, and for engaging with our research. So again, I say it again, this is the first step, not the last one. So we're certainly doing more, and hopefully this insights that we give are also inspiring you to do a little bit more as well. So if there is a chance, Claudia, maybe Professor Foster wants to make some final remarks before ending the seminar.
I just look, yeah, thanks. Now you can say a few words if you want. You.
Hi, James. You're able to take up the mic if you'd like.
If you're having issues with your mic, James, we cannot hear you. We're very sorry. Feel free to text also in the Q&A if you want to say something or to share some insights. Yeah, we're very sure we're going to hear you, James. But thank you for joining. And we know that it was a really tricky time for you, and we really appreciate that you are here with us. So yeah, just wanted to say thank you, everyone, and I'm sure that there might be more questions. So as Ricardo highlighted, feel free to reach out. Thank you for joining us both online and in person.
Thank you very much, everyone, and thank you to Sabina and Lhachi. See you in the next one.
All of the team. See you. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Claudia, can you throw some samosas this way too?